Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin a two-day program on the theme of our collective pursuit of home. All of us need a place that we feel a sense of belonging. All of us want to be able to have a home somewhere. And yet it's a very challenging proposition for most of us. Today marks the anniversary. It was on this day back in 1968, shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, that President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Bill into law. This was the last major piece of legislation that President Johnson persuaded the U.S. Congress to pass during the 1960s. And it sought to ameliorate some of the racial profiling and racist practices that had become embedded in U.S. Housing law and housing practice. And ever since then, people of color, African Americans in particular, have had real challenges in bringing together their sense of home in any kind of meaningful democratic way. And so the struggles around housing, the struggles around democratic processes to ensure fair and open housing have been integral to the struggle of people of color and Black people in particular to find a home. So today we're going to embark on a two-day program of this very complex but serious domain. Before we do that, let us pause as we always do as we open our sessions of Humanity Rising, and let us just simply breathe consciously and coherently together. In a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the bell, just breathe in slowly till you hear another bell and breathe out slowly. And we'll take 10 breaths together, and then we'll begin our program. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. It's always so good to breathe together, whatever's happening in that wider world. of ours. It's my pleasure now to welcome back, actually, April DeSimone, who was on our Humanity Rising program several weeks ago. She's a transdisciplinary designer. She looks at the interface between race, our built environment, and those forces that are shaping the future. She's the founder of the Democracy Project and really has dedicated her professional and personal life to looking at these issues of our sense of belonging and the need for home, but within the complexities of race and social and governmental policy. So today, on the anniversary of the signing of the Fair Housing Bill, we want to welcome April to Humanity Rising, who will be convening our two-day program together. So April, thank you so much for joining us, and I turn the program over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim and Stan and the entire Humanity Rising group for welcoming us back and really expanding this conversation around democracy. And, as you mentioned, today is such a pivotal moment in American history where we are celebrating the courageous act by President LBJ to sign the Fair Housing Act. Just a little bit of background for any newcomers onto the programming. Myself and Ann Richardson are part of this bigger group called the Practice of Democracy, where we are exploring not just from a racial lens, but again, legacies of dehumanization that have really splintered these beliefs and concepts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'd like to welcome Ann to share a few words as to why this journey is important and why we must resuscitate this concept of democracy and how acts like what President Johnson did on April 11th, 1968, as Jim mentioned, a few short days after the assassination of Dr. King, really, again, is a monumental nod in action to this practice of democracy. So thank you for listening, Ann. Welcome. Always good to share space with you.
Yeah. Just a small correction. It's Robertson, but that's I'll be Ann Richardson today. I am so honored to be back on Humanity Rising and working alongside April, who has created what I think is one of the most exciting collectives, collaborative initiatives to bring attention, much needed attention to the inequities in our many of our governmental departments and in many different ways throughout the country. And we share a very, very common bond and through our family histories and backgrounds on how and why democracy is vital. We all know that, we all understand that on one level, but I think through some of the unique experiences we both have had in different ways at different times throughout our lives, it's really impacted us in some very, very fundamental ways. And so I'm honored to, as I said, to be not only here at Humanity Rising, but also working alongside April, who's created this opportunity to dialogue and have people really understand it in a way that I don't think people truly do. So I won't take much more time, but I know this is just the beginning of something that we are working on, but collectively throughout the country. Excited to share some more with Humanity Rising. April?
It's really exciting, Ann, again, given our distinct backgrounds. And I always love the ethos it raises around what we're doing with this work and how people from different backgrounds, different experiences really come together to lift up actionable opportunities beyond just the voting booth of how democratic values show up in our built environment, and we do so, block by block. I am going to share my screen here, and part of this discussion again is this road to the Fair Housing Act, and it's the first of a two-part series. Today we'll look at just all the tumultuous events and sort of these conditionings and that gray path that leads us to LBJ's signing of this historic legislation that, again, even today is still being tested. And of course, understanding sort of the widening gaps as housing is becoming, a huge issue and threat to democracy of who can access it and who is represented fairly in this work. So this concept of in pursuit of home is not just the physical structure of a home, but even the ecology that home operates in. It's this understanding that it's the ability to walk down your street, have cohesion with neighbors, have the amenities that you need. And sort of, again, what is this concept of home for all of us? And what is this pursuit of home in our communities? So, one of the big aspects of this concept of home really begins to shift with density as we move from, again, these agrarian economies into more the industrial economies. And it really begins to bring in the density and the overcrowding. But even before, even under agrarian economies, you'll see in ordinances up with the Dutch in New York, just how health and proximity and all of these factors begin to play a factor on how we grid or create this concept of home or ecology of home. And again, we move into these moments of the Industrial Revolution and these displaced agrarian economies. And what you begin to see, particularly with the influx of the labor forces coming in to the urban cores, in particular, higher density. And that is aided and abetted, of course, with transportation. And you see sort of this rise of the overcrowding. And again, as overcrowding is taking place, this concept of home begins to take on this public health concern, of course, with the different outbreaks that were occurring. Of course, New York is sort of the hot belly of just because of the influx of the labor force that comes in, and this concept of wanting to early concept of slum clearance. Again, not understanding these ecologies of home, but just understanding that these were worker housing, and as a result, action needed to take place. But of course, at this point in history, government isn't really stepping in and taking on this matter. It's local officials and more of this philanthropic understanding. And as is highlighted here, we see that between 4 million immigrants arrived, and where were they going to be housed? And what did housing look like for these newly arrived populations? And the irony again is that as labor is transitioning into and from the Industrial Revolution, what we also see is this is simultaneously conscientiously rising with the moments we begin to really create the more sophisticated grid system of America and the urban core. And this is also happening at a time where scientific racism is on the rise. So as, of course, new immigrant populations are coming in, particularly from Europe, we have this conscientious psychology building around that immigration aspect of threat. Why this all becomes important is because it frames this concept of home. That here are the labor forces trying to find decent and affordable housing for their labor, but of course this concept of slum and ghetto begins to rise. And again, this concept of dehumanization begins to take place, where we create home through hierarchy. And we'll see this through subsequent planning theories and histories that again really begin to look at identity and make identity synonymous with this concept of who has adequate housing and who doesn't. And we know that, again, as government, and as this is all occurring throughout America, we see the rise, of course, of wealth happening through industrialization, and that one of the earliest forms of housing was the tenement housing model. And before the government even stepped in to proliferate this typology of housing, philanthropy stepped in. And philanthropy was really taking the position that the conditions, not only because of what people were experiencing, but just as we saw with the COVID outbreak, that close proximity of deadly viruses that were really, tuberculosis and beyond, didn't know boundaries or a grid system. So people felt an urgency as well that I don't want that affecting me. So how do we begin to address and come together and focus this concept of home and equitable housing? And as you can see from the tenement housing here, where my mouse is hovering over, these were well built, affordable ecologies that really begin to change a narrative of space within the community. And one thing to consider and keep in mind as we're learning about sort of the advent of the nonprofit sector coming in and advancing housing opportunities, what are the questions we can consider as we go along this pathway and journey around this concept of the pursuit of home? In what ways are today's versions of nonprofit housing similar to the model tenement of the housing of the 19th century? And early 20th century? And do we still apply the same hierarchy of value and this concept of deserving and undeserving when we look at housing? And of course, we're going to go through in this In Pursuit of Home series how to unpack that, because we even still hear vernacular and language, despite people working 3 jobs, this connotation that is layered upon individuals or households as low income, middle income, luxury. And again, the cognitive conditioning is that we reinforce hierarchy within the built environment. And how does that hierarchy, again, reinforce these spatial dynamics that not only segregate along the lines of race, which is the most obvious from a historical and present day perspective, but class and identity and culture? And how do these narratives, again, induce the conditions that we have today? And very early on, the top picture here, we go from an industrial economy to an enormous wealth. Everyone's stepping in, or I should say philanthropy is trying to figure out what home actually equates into the built environment. We know we have this Great Depression and this stark flattening of the threat to home. And we know that home is as synonymous to Americana and democratic values, property, et cetera, and that's under threat through this Great Depression. And as this Great Depression is rising, this concept of moral environmentalism becomes more entrenched, where, again, this narrative of the Hoover Bills, which are some of the photos here that we're capturing. What did Hoover Bills present, and what was this condition of home in our built environment? And again, this concept of we need to clear out the blocks, we need to create healthier spaces also had a ramification, because it wasn't just about clearing and making healthier blocks. Through these early forms of what becomes urban renewal or slum clearance, we're also clearing the diversity of communities. And then what gets built back in subsequent years, particularly under New Deal policies, become highly segregated spaces. So again, this concept of moral environmentalism infused with deserving and undeserving really begins to formulate this concept around our ecology of home. And again, taking a step back, what do we mean by eugenics and scientific racism? And how does this hierarchy of human value begin to translate into these concepts of home? If you're not familiar, people like Davenport begin to follow what Galton brings and imports this from England around. He's a chicken breeder. and basically begins to formulate this concept of value within the built environment. And we often hear this around who the threat to our homes, to the NIMBYism movement, not in our backyard. There are these boundaries that really are accentuated by this concept of who is, again, deserving, what are the stories between or behind identity. And here are just a few examples of ethnicities and sort of the unfit human traits. And this was a vast movement, particularly in the 1900s, early 1900s, early 20th century in this country. And the people that are now in positions being influenced by these movements later become the experts of housing and home value within the built environment. People like Madison Grant, who is a mentor to the future president, Teddy Roosevelt, begins to pass books or write books or amplify this dialogue around the great race and the threats to the great race or supremacy. And when these books are unleashed, or this language is unleashed, again, it creates a spatial footprint of what then home becomes based on this conditioning and thinking. Madison Grant, in his book, The Passing of the Great Race, written in 1916, is an anti-immigration call to action to say we need to close American borders. But we don't know this history of Madison Grant. We celebrate him as a conservationist, the founder of the Sierra Club, all of this progressive conversation. But deep down inside, it's, again, the correlation of how ideology is a threat to this concept of pursuit, of how we pursue home. And then we see in 1910, Mayor Mahul, begins to enact ordinances about quarantining and constricting movement in the built environment. And then we see how all of this begins to take effect through people like Homer Hoyt. Homer Hoyt, in his dissertation at the University of Chicago, begins to create the sector theory of planning that follows other planning zonings. And again, we're all impacted by this. It isn't just through this concept of segregation, but when we think of this concept of pursuit of home, how can we pursue healthy habitat and shelter when the psychology that is dictating our access to home has always been predicated on, again, creating value? The sector theory of housing, which Homer Hoyt, who's in this photo, creates, basically, if you look at the chart, begins to isolate sort of noxious or toxic manufacturing in certain areas, and then begins to build up the segregated residential zones in our communities. And again, when we are looking at our challenges today of housing, how do we connect this history to, again, accessibility today? So the sector zoning, concentric zone theory really use this concept of isolating classes within communities. And his dissertation, 100 Years of Land Value, it's a little blurry, but if you can see, you have the 10 ethnicities that are most detrimental to land. This isn't someone's thought, this isn't someone's opinion, but again, when you look, aside from Black and brown individuals being 9 and 10 as most detrimental, Italians, Lithuanians, Irish were all also considered detrimental. So we move from the heels of this thinking, and people like Homer Hoyt, who in his dissertation would create this psychology, now he's the chief economist of, again, one of the greatest social programs and government welfare programs of our time was the New Deal. And again, understanding the concept of home and inaccessibility and unhealthy habitat, we know that the New Deal, through its housing policies, radicalizes the geographic footprint of America, and essentially is what creates the American middle class. And unfortunately, when we have this amazing program that has proven to work well, when we look at communities that have long been were not considered valuable, but as I mentioned before, when this erasure comes in, what gets built was predicated on segregation. And even, this is now north of the Mason-Dixon line. So what we're looking at is an example of redlining maps, because before the New Deal, in order to buy a home, you had to put 30 to 50% down. The terms were typically 5 to 7 years. And then after the 5th or 7th year, a person would refinance. Home ownership was incredibly complex to have access to. And unfortunately, when the Great Depression happens, the option to refinance was no longer there. So we had a hemorrhaging and a foreclosure crisis throughout this country. So the government steps in and understands that the banks are too big to fail, the insurance companies are too big to fail, and we need to stop this hemorrhaging. So they put out of work real estate agents that, again, are conditioned in this psychology of neighborhood value to create maps that, again, weren't just now, they existed before, but to determine which neighborhoods were worthy of investment and which weren't. 60% of a color coding of a neighborhood depended on income and identity, who lived there, and part of that detrimental influence. The most optimal places for investment were the green zones, and because they usually practice restrictive deeds or covenants, followed by blue, then yellow, then red. Yellow would become red in 2 to 3 years because they began to study migratory patterns, the government did, around influx and transition of neighborhoods. So it really created a footprint, and then it unleashed the most favorable loan programs that, again, essentially create the American middle class. So now the 5 to 7 year term is a 15 to 30 year mortgage that many of us are familiar with very little down payment, that allowed families to move into areas that once they could never have that opportunity to do. And when you think of the time plus the GI Bill, this creates what's known as intergenerational wealth. And this intergenerational wealth begins to build accessibility, opportunities within the different communities that, again, historically just weren't there. So this is a redlining map of the New York metro area. And this is an area description to then determine the color codes of communities. And the argument is, if it wasn't about identity of who lived in a neighborhood, then why would you have question C there considered what is a detrimental influence? And you see in black and white, these are government documents, Negro infiltration. So it really, again, is another layer in addition to what we've talked about that creates this infiltration concept and this othering and pariah within the built environment. And it's not as if this didn't happen before. What is egregious is that those who were put in the positions of authority to steward the ideologies and principles of our democracy are now making decisions that today have a vast collateral consequence to what we see in our neighborhoods and in our communities. How did your community become what it is today, and what you're seeing? If you trace those roots back enough, it's built on these philosophies, which again become a threat to our collective democracy. And quickly, if you look at question E, infiltration of Italian and Negro. So this concept of coding, this social construct of whiteness didn't really exist for many. And sort of this assimilation into this concept only begins to happen, particularly as massive suburbanization takes place in America. And of course, everyone is aiding and abetting this psychology. And it's only funded and only possible by the federal funding of the creation of the massive suburbanization of America. There are several books, including Crabgrass Frontier by Kenneth Jackson, who discovers redlining maps in the 70s. And FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, went through tremendous effort to destroy a lot of their records so that we couldn't disaggregate from a county level, but into the blocks to understand the real stories of how lending took place. And of course, this fueled a real estate speculation similar today. And here's an excerpt from a real estate book, the textbook that's being used again, up until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And you can read for yourself, and I'll share that The colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes and forego their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. So it's again a direct infraction and indictment to democratic values and principles that again would not be possible or feasible had it not been for the massive infusion of federal money into the suburbanization of America. And at one point, the maps are no longer necessary. And what we begin to do, in addition to the maps, into what we call restrictive deeds or covenants or racial zoning, is we begin to create an underwriting manual that sort of predicates what and how we are going to lend into communities, regardless of where these maps are. Again, there's 239 created under the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And then from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration unleashes this manual that again is used up until the until the 1968 Fair Housing Act. But it basically creates all types of restrictions around lending and the ability to access the resources, similar to the travesties and barriers we're still facing today. So again, deed restrictions. In the homes, they would have stipulations that would indicate who could live in a neighborhood. And again, if you were pursuing home, you had the distinctions between, for example, a Black Army vet that served his country in World War II, coming to places like Levittown, Long Island, or Levittown, Pennsylvania, trying to access the GI Bill. But in the homes were deed restrictions that indicated that you cannot sell to anyone who's outside of the Caucasian race. And if those restrictions were violated, despite even having a Supreme Court ruling that they're not enforceable by law, it wasn't for any type of sympathy towards the egregiousness of what was happening. It was to say property rights are above all other restrictions. And when this happens, if the deed restriction wasn't enforceable by law, it was enforceable by incredible violence. And we see examples of that throughout the country of where people wanted to live and reside. And again, these real threats to our humanity. Because why? Because I am incredibly fearful of who and what lives here. And then again, you had just this opportunity to say, if we're going to lend in areas, because people in like The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein begins to talk about that people actually did not want this, and saying, hey, what can we do to really circumvent these types of restrictions and indictments to our democracy? So when people would come up with plans to how to do an inclusive development or integrated development, you had to come up to show that even if they hid the social and racial composition of a neighborhood, that it was still a clause that, again, creates this spatialized psychology of inequity. And what you would have in addition to deed restrictions was zoning. So let's say now that the plot to try to integrate a neighborhood and use federal and state resources actually went through. On a local level, another barrier was the zoning would transform. So if it was a 1/4 acre lot and they caught wind that this was going to, what was being done, the zoning board would just increase the acreage to now 1 acre or 2, which then disrupts the financial mechanism of accessibility. So this is an example in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the types of homes that practice deed restrictions. And again, these are not some palace in the hills. These were everyday homes and neighborhoods that really, again, create a social fabric that accentuate these concepts of democracy and democratic values. But here, the Myers family, as you can see, are one of the first Black families to integrate into Levittown. And the house still exists. I've driven by it. And you look at sort of the neighborhood composition, which is somewhat more integrated today, not much, but it really shows sort of the legacies of these dehumanizing policies that again create the footprint of where we live. And because of just economics and trying to work, the opportunity to even buy into neighborhoods that once were accessible to everyone are no longer feasible or accessible. And when people like the Myers attempted to move in, they were met with enormous violence and broken windows, burning of crosses on their lawn. And we know that, you know, the tensions are rising in America, and people are tired of being sort of ostracized and restricted to the most deplorable conditions of living. And this concept of home is constantly under threat. And we see the rise of civil rights that was a very integrated, unified front. And the irony is when you look at sort of what people are asking for then in 1963, is the same concepts of what people are asking for today: better jobs, decent housing, better wages, and to end the racial discrimination or violence, period, in this country. And we see, you know, whether it's Selma or Voting Rights Act, you know, this pathway to even this concept of home lives in, again, this bigger ecology that's constantly threatening sort of the existence of individuals. And of course, we see rent strikes. We see, again, this incredible violence that really, again, wants to restrict who has access into an area. And then we see the uprisings occur. And depending on your views, some call them riots, some call them uprising, where again, it's this human consciousness awakening to these beliefs of democratic values and what's happening in our country. And we know that from here, we see the burning, essentially, of the two Americas. And the powerful Kerner Commission is placed together by President Johnson. And the irony of the conflict that existed between the Kerner Commission appointees and President Johnson, because he's saying, I'm at least trying to do something in passing all these civil rights legislation. And the report was so damning. It was saying, look at what, as a nation who purports equity, equality, justice, freedom, and all of these concepts we all are binded by. Look at the reality of the two Americas and the two realities on the ground. And so the Kerner Commission releases this report and understanding sort of what's happening on the ground and then in the halls of Congress, and these attempts to try to address the conditions that were being raised in the Kerner Commission report. And the stalemating, particularly by Southern Democrats, from this being able to happen. And it's highlighting, again, just the concept of how housing and neighborhood condition, as it says here, quote, rob Americans of freedom, particularly in the urban environments, as we're creating these conditions as urban being pariah. And again, this consciousness of understanding that we are a collective, that we have to stand up to what is happening in America. And one of the very pivotal moments, of course, that begins to create the tipping point that takes this sort of boiling pot, of course, is the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And it deeply affected President Johnson. And then the riotings and uprisings occurred even more far-fetched. And again, it was this restriction of this social contract, a moral contract that we are all signing up to, but why do we continue to put people in power or allow the violence on the ground that, again, really has dictated how our communities exist today? And we see that President Johnson, again, from the heels and what's happening in this country, signs, the Congress passes the bill on April 10th, 1968, and President Johnson signs it into law in 1968. And it's this courage to understand sort of where we are at, and this tugging of the consciousness of how do we rise above the implications. This is part one, and next tomorrow we'll continue, not to go into more detail around the 1968 Fair Housing Act, but also what happened immediately after, what's been done, how it correlates to the work myself and Anne are doing, and where are we at today in this journey or quest in pursuit of home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, April. And I wonder if Anne wants to rejoin.
I'd give people a moment, Jim, to just read the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, just this quote, if folks want to take a little minute, because if you remove the date, which was 1973, it's applicable very much to this journey of housing today.
Good. Now, Anne, do you want to make any comment on what April has said before we
Sure.
move into the session?
Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, no, the presentation is just is incredible, April, and I think you really clearly, show the history here, and the question that was plaguing me for really for a long time as to how we sort of got back to the Hooverville times, the robber baron days, where the income and racial wealth gap is just enormous, unlike or very similar to the Roaring '20s. And an interesting book I read that helped me understand how we got back here is a book I highly recommend everybody read. It's called Goliath: The 100-Year Battle Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. And during the clearly during the Roaring '20s, we had, just immense, a very small group of folks called the robber barons who had power, both political, economic, and that led up to the Great Depression. And as FDR came in and replaced Hoover, he brought with him some really interesting people, one of which is from Texas. I live in Austin, Texas, and this shocked me, is the gentleman by the name of Wright Patman. Wright Patman was a congressman, U.S. congressman from Texarkana, Texas, who was very incensed by the robber barons and the power that they yielded and wielded during that time. And he came in towards the latter part of the 1920s and was particularly focused on one individual, Andrew Mellon. Mellon was Secretary of Treasury throughout the Roaring '20s, an unabashed monopolist. And Patman was quite the true populist, not the populist we see today, much more of the fascist. But he really helped, in addition to Louis Brandeis and many others that came in during the early part of FDR's administration, to really look at how to break up high concentrations of money, wealth, and power. They did, of course, a New Deal, antitrust, anti-monopoly enforcement, and during that time between the 40s and up until the mid to late 70s, the middle class grew. We had prosperity, not shared prosperity, unfortunately, as we still had Jim Crow, and there were still many people who were left out of the economic system. But we were starting to really right this ship, I would say, and had us into much more of a democratic nation. And what I learned, by reading that book was the forces that were behind the scenes started to, and those were the supply side economists that really morphed into what Milton Friedman, the philosophy of let the free market reign, started to take root mid to late 70s, and Reagan walked into office, and the first thing he says is the government is the enemy of the people, or I can't remember the exact quote. But ever since then, we have seen just this again. They took the pedals off the antitrust, anti-monopoly, and we are now back, as April described, back into the times that were very similar to the Hoovervilles, and this is a time in I think our country's history to really start to look at the forces behind what's brought us back to the inequalities, and particularly the racial inequalities. So that helped. That book really helped me to understand, and it goes into much more detail than I just did. A few other books that I do recommend. One is I'm reading now by Naomi Oreskes, who really takes this understanding of what happened and how did we get back to the robber baron, quote unquote, days. It's called The Big Myth: How Business Taught Us to Loathe the Government and Love the Free Market. So it just came out in the last month, but that's just a few thoughts.
Well, thank you both. I'd like to bring in Richard Page's comments for the conversation. He points out that he bought a house in El Cerrito, California, and when he bought the house, the title company wanted him to sign a statement that he would not sell it to anybody of the Mongoloid or Negroid races. He struck that paragraph out, but that's an example of how recent, very explicit racist language has been included in these title documents and these, racial profiling. It wasn't something that was hidden or, by innuendo. It was something that was right there in black and white. And then he also points out, and I'd like to have your comment on this, April, that there was a conference on Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley on the Kerner Commission 50 years later. So that would be 2018. And their assertion was nothing had changed. And so we're in a situation, and as you were just pointing out, where in some ways it's gotten worse because of, the Trump Republican white supremacist upsurge and phenomenon is taking off any veneer to very explicit white supremacy and racism. So we've got a long way to go. And since you've been in this so deeply, April, what would be your comment on what Richard is bringing in, that the situation is actually the same, if not worse, today?
Incredibly, it's poignant and spot on. And I think it was so overt before, as we're highlighting, and it was in practice, because and that's the education that needs to happen, is that we have this belief after Reconstruction everything was great for America, and it's kind of pull yourself up by this bootstrap. And it just shows that no matter how populations tried, there was this larger psychology of forces and practices and investments coming in. And it is accurate, and it's gotten worse because the economy, not only that you can't just be in a space, you can't afford to be in a space. And what's happening now, Jim, is as property places like the Bronx, where I'm from, and this is why the project Ann and I are doing in Trenton. And we again invite your listeners and membership to come and listen to what we're doing there and support in what way they can for that April 30th event we'll share more about tomorrow. But think about this for a second, Jim. We come from this history. And then if you try to invest in your neighborhood, there is still restriction on land value. And you ask, well, why is this worth this? And literally across the street, it's worth this because there's this boundary. There is no concept or logical answer for it other than what this is at the roots. And the sad thing is that these canvases that were, again, these disinvested communities have the opportunity to show what we can really be as Americans. And this supersedes boundaries, political boundaries of Republican, Democrat. Everyone had their hand in that cookie jar, and we're eating those cookies. It wasn't just this concept, this language of supremacy. It's economic supremacy now. It's economic redlining, because the neighborhoods that were once available, you can no longer afford to even live in. And then the neighborhoods that you can afford to live in have suffered from the disinvestment for generations. So that when you say, can we kind of rebuild here? They say no. And the only way we'll rebuild is by erasure and gentrification and making those neighborhoods unaffordable for the next generation. So it's a vicious cycle that I think more Americans need to wake up to. And again, whether you live in a community like that or not, you have to be part of the solution. And that's, again, the work we're trying to offer, is how do we come together, whether it's building a legal trust, a policy trust, whatever it is. We are under threat in so many different ways. And the unraveling of the social fabric of our neighborhoods and our communities even allows for that more to happen, where the dominant narrative is we are so divided. And more of us want to come together and take on what we've inherited, because what hovers above all of this, not shaming or blaming, it's saying we have agency, and it's our collective responsibility to scale our humanity. And this is inhumane and dehumanizing on so many levels, obviously. So it hasn't changed. We have a lot of work to do, but we have to be willing to come together to understand what's viable solutions, because it's not working what we're doing.
Yes, Anne, do you have any comment?
Well, I would also have, there's another interesting book that really helped me understand the economic forces behind. It's called Racism in the Neo-Economic in Liberal Era, and Meta History of White Elite Power. And I'm sorry if I don't have the exact title, but what has come about is the forces behind these huge, growing larger companies have really coalesced behind this white supremacist theory or strain in our nations. It's been there obviously since the beginning of this country, and it's really kind of shocked me when I saw the coalescing of these. And this book helped me to understand how that happened and why.
Yeah. I'd like to just back up and into a little bit of history here and get both of your comments on this notion of private property. Because, if you look at some of the dialogues between the Native Americans in North America and the European settlers, one of the things that was the most shocking to them was that they were in a boundless ecosystem where there was no sense of ownership and therefore a sense of mobility and enhanced personal right to both disobey and to move around, and they were really challenging. And that was one of the the origins of what became, the Enlightenment notion of freedom and human rights was the challenge by the North Americans around property rights. And I want to bring in also Jacques Rousseau's, who wrote The Social Contract. And he said in that work, really examining the social contract between people, that if he had to identify an original sin, it was private property. And the way he puts it, when the first man looked upon the earth and said, "This is mine," that was the origin of sin and inequality and injustice and exploitation and rapaciousness on the earth. And, that's obviously a debatable point, but I bring it because what you both are bringing in today is the insidious qualities that emanate from this notion of mine as opposed to yours. And how do I manipulate mine so that it's more valuable than yours, so that my neighborhood's a good neighborhood? No, you're only right across the street. You're in a bad neighborhood, so you aren't worth as much as I am. So it's the racism in some ways has emanated out of a deeper inequality. And I would love to have both of you just comment on that.
I love what you're saying, Jim. And again, I think it's dehumanization. I love, it's because it didn't matter. It's just who at this point is the bullseye to take on. And I think that, this is the work. And as First Nations, this concept of communal, was really accentuated. And it's such a, where it was practiced, it's so important. And I think that turning to these value systems can exist in our current model, right? And again, that's what we're trying to look at, is that how do we not focus on using property? And we've had many forms of property on this soil, whether it was human property, whether it was chattel or livestock, or whether it was land. And it's been violent at the very foundation since day one of how acquisition took place, and who was, again, homesteading. It's not that the people who went and did it were wrong, it's that it was aided and abetted by a larger calling, manifest destiny, and go out and expand west, young man. And I think that's the work that we all have to come together to create the other narrative, right? To go back to this social contract of I am my brother's keeper, the barn build, because it does exist in subcultures in America, right? You will see that in the Amish community. You will see that in a lot of different places, this concept of communal. And it has never had the opportunity to rise and be the dominant narrative. And I think that we need to get that narrative going that really challenges this. But one of the biggest barriers, Jim, these systems are so entrenched, it's not going to just go away tomorrow. What we need to do is really come up, with, again, this very transdisciplinary ecosystem where finance really takes a step forward, the type of finance we're talking about. Because if we're in a community and we want to fix it, and they're saying we don't see it as valuable for fixing, we need to lobby and say, well, what are the policies we need to do that? But we also have to step out of that space and say, what can we do together to just even disrupt that narrative of value, right? Because once you do that, it's going to create a chain reaction, because you're forcing people cognitively to reconsider these boundaries that we're all, unfortunately, victims to. Every single one of us have been a victim to it. Whether you live in a green neighborhood or a blue neighborhood or a yellow neighborhood, we are all suffering that collateral consequence of these legacies of dehumanization. So we have work to do.
Yeah, a lot of work.
And Jim, I was I just saw recently that an article that flashed through my inbox, and haven't had a time to take a look at it, but to read it, but I will later today. And I, a couple, maybe 2 years ago, I learned through somebody who'd worked closely with the Vatican about the doctrine of discovery that came over with Christopher Columbus, and it basically gave license to commit genocide in this country. And it's been the kind of the backbone for the property rights in many ways. And the Vatican is actually thinking about rescinding the doctrine of discovery because it's still in some ways in practice. And it's not as obviously as active as it once was, but it's it was a shock to me to learn, I mean, not total shock, but to learn how embedded these thinkings and these thoughts are, of course, with our, some of our religious, particularly, going back, centuries and centuries ago. So it's, and currently there are some very interesting folks at the Vatican that are trying to right a lot of wrongs that did emanate from there. But there's a lot of legacy there that's still harming and hurting.
Well, just to dwell on that for a second, thank you for raising it, Anne, because at the heart of the promulgation of the papal bull at the time was a division of property. The Portuguese and the Spanish wanted the Pope to basically carve up the Western Hemisphere south of what is now Mexico between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and that's how Portugal got Brazil and Spain got everything else. It was basically a papal sanction of the division of property. And if you read the actual document, one of the reasons why the Europeans and the Christians gave themselves the prerogative to exploit and colonize in every imaginable way is because these natives, these savages, didn't have a concept of property rights.
Exactly.
That was their problem. That was their problem. And so you're absolutely right. And I think it was a couple of weeks ago now, we did a session on Humanity Rising on it. The Pope Francis has repudiated, but not apologized.
Exactly. Yeah.
For this. And it's worth knowing that the term doctrine of discovery was actually coined by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Interesting.
Back in the early 1800s, when it codified in U.S. federal law the doctrine of discovery. And the most recent affirmation was, I think it was in 2006, in a majority opinion by no one less than Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes.
Who affirmed the doctrine of discovery as the foundation of federal jurisprudence vis-a-vis the Native Americans, and the assertion that they have no rights over land that they used to have, because that's now owned as property, either the U.S. government or state governments or municipal governments, so they can own property, but they don't have any sovereign rights. So it's an extraordinary phenomenon in our collective history that we gave ourselves such fundamental supremacy, almost without thinking about it. But the overwhelming kind of impression, April, that you're giving is that is very much alive and well in the USA today.
Globally, I mean, from climate, who's on the front lines of the susceptibility of the climate change and with flooding, in the Bronx, when we had one of these, super storms. It wasn't Sandy. It was more recent. I can't remember. I think it was Marie. I can't remember the name. I'm not going to say it. But you had people living in illegal units and basements that died because the flood water came in. And again, all of, whether it's the doctrine, whether it's, you know, the Fair Housing Act, we can, whatever we can repudiate, we could pass fair housing legislation, but we know that these are like the Spanish Armada to try to navigate that. It's going to start here on this level, humanizing one another and saying, how do I become a practitioner of these concepts of democracy? And housing is at the core of all of that. And it's a big part of it. And I think that, again, we've inherited tremendous, it's getting worse in the sense of the barriers and the inequities and the disparities, because home predicates education, health, you know, all the social determinants of health, if we were to look at it, become impacted by neighborhood context and structure and home. And how silly is it that we have bought into this whole, many of us, not all of us, many of us have bought into this. And you know, I was having a meeting yesterday with someone when I explained my situation in Trenton, right? And whether it was my situation or someone else's, because this is the word. The fact that they were like, well, you can just take a HELOC loan now and you can cover the cost to repair your home. And I said, did you not just listen to what I just said? Like, and you're put in a position of authority to then plan my neighborhood and make decisions for me. You should not be there if you can simplify what's actually happening. Because I had just explained how we were approved for X amount. And literally when we said where we wanted to live, which is Trenton, New Jersey, the money literally was cut in half. And there's no explanation as to why. And that same home 10 minutes away is a $4 million home in Princeton, New Jersey. And when you explain, and I said, you know, the home cost is cheaper for, that's where we can afford to live, first of all. Second of all, it's 3 times the amount to live in a neighborhood outside of Trenton with lesser quality of housing stock, right? So I would be paying more and having issues with the house, pay even more, right? So here was a place where we said, my husband and I, we want to invest. It's cheap enough, but it needs about $400,000 worth of repair. And we had that in what we were approved for. And when we said Trenton, no. So instead, what we got was $100,000 to repair a home that for generations has been neglected because of just where it is on the map. It had nothing to do with my ability to pay, because we were able to pay. And even when we can pay, they tell us, no, you cannot do it, because the home to loan value is, and I said, I don't understand how you come up with these numbers. I don't understand how it's okay for you to continue redlining, and I do this work. And when we look at the federal policies that are in place, there's nothing that fair housing can do for me to challenge that. The only thing to challenge that is to do it anyway. And that's what we're doing. We're going to try to figure out how to do this out anyway, because when you do that, you challenge the numbers. And when you challenge the numbers and you can put things in a community equity fund versus it coming into my pocket, it becomes a different model of finance around this work. But the person, after explaining all what I just explained to you, told me, well, you could take out a home equity loan. Okay. All right. How can I take out a home equity loan if they're saying there's no equity or value in that home? I don't get it.
Yeah.
But
You know, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
And this is what
let's turn, April and then Ann, you know, in this thicket of institutional racism and redlining and all kinds of restrictions so embedded in the culture and law that we don't even know that they exist for the most part. What would you say people should do? I mean, the ordinary people on this call that want to be aware, what's your counsel to people if, you know, they're buying a home or, you know, they want to be helpful in some way in this domain?
I would say
it's not that I don't have anything to say. I'm just I'm going to give some time to Anne, and then I will I'll add to what Anne has to say.
Well, I think, can you hear me? I do think I'm unmuted. I think really paying close attention to what are the local policies that are important to these type of issues, and I think as I have gotten to know and now working with April, alongside April, I am much more attuned and really starting to and not to the degree that I yet, but I will be, and I'm meeting with some folks in the next couple of weeks who have their eyes both on the city level, but also on the state level here in Texas. And how are those policies affecting neighborhoods, communities, positively and or negatively, obviously. I heard a couple of months ago, it was on a PBS, I think it was mainstream media, about a group, and I've got to go back and find it, but there is there's a foundation that is funding ordinary citizens to really look at to be transcribers and go into these citywide meetings that are open to the public, and really transcribe where's the money going, again, where the policy, where's the money going, where there's opportunity for citizens engagement. I think as citizens, it's going to be imperative more and more that we really focus on that and start to add our voice and our efforts to vote those people out that are not helping communities, particularly communities like that April grew up in. And I've seen here in Austin, Texas, tragically, the East Side, when we moved here 16 years ago, predominantly Black and Brown community. They've been totally just kicked out, and it's probably one of the most gentrified areas in the country, if not in my opinion. And so there's I think there's a lot of ways that all of us can start to, and myself included, wake up and really pay attention to these, what the policymakers are doing, and who are they funded by too.
Yeah, there's certainly opportunity, Jim, for, as Anne is mentioning, sort of the policy track. And there's a lot of work to do there. And again, I think that there is an agency to just step out of this. And what we've been looking at, and we'll go into more, is neighborhood REITs, a real estate investment trust, because ironically, those structures are the very structures that come in backed by lots of money that create the erasure or exacerbate the affordability. And we're seeing, the Pencil building in Manhattan, for example, just how foreign investment can create speculation and commodification in this model. And what these neighborhood REITs will do would come in, taking philanthropic money and other investment, that people who want to cure this and pilot, because we don't have the answer or the silver bullet. But what we need to do is, what happens when someone takes that risk, similar to these REITs, comes into a neighborhood, and instead of that being extracted out of the neighborhood, and then the aftermath of what the story of gentrification is, how can it create a back end mechanism that the equity increase gets captured into the fund itself, where myself as an owner or others beyond will be able to give up, right? So that challenges this concept that it's mine, that I give up a portion of my equity to put back into this fund to pay it forward. And the concept is doing this block by block, because what we end up doing, and again, we'll go more into this next session, but think about it. Once we create value in one house on a block, right? We're forcing a legal challenge to appraisals. on that block, because now you have a comp. So there may be people that want to come in and do this, and may not want to use the REIT, but you set up the alternative model to do this, but now I can have value. Also, it creates the opportunity for our existing neighbors to then be able to repair their home. Think about it. The home that I'm talking about in Trenton, and many of the homes in Trenton, have raw sewage in them. And how are we talking about infrastructure equity? We have an infrastructure bill coming down the pipeline, right? But yet you still have people living in human waste in America. And not just in urban cores, in Appalachia and rural areas as well. So what we're trying to create is a REIT portfolio that comes in and takes this risk and build that fund up, that becomes the counter narrative to the traditional, how do we do this? And then when that equity increases, because it will, it's not the solution, it's one approach, but that we capture that equity in a fund and we're able to do other things, whether it's economic development, funding local businesses, that really begin to create an ecology, but everyone is paying forward in some form or fashion, that we're part of a cohesive group that says we want to counter this narrative at the same time.
Well, thank you both. This has been a fascinating discussion. And in particular, I really want to acknowledge the history that you've brought in. This is a deep issue that goes back very profoundly into both the psyche and the property law evolving over centuries. And so to extricate ourselves from it is not going to be an easy process, and is going to require both solidarity and a lot of creativity and courage to get us out of this particular thicket. So I want to just thank you both for everything that you're doing in this domain, and look forward to hearing more tomorrow. And then possibly tomorrow you can say more about what you have planned for the 30th of April, because I know you have a big event that we want to support at that time as well.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, April. Thank you, Anne. That'll do it for us for today, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. And then we'll see April and Anne tomorrow for the second and final session of their program on the importance of home, finding a home, which all of us need, because we all have the same sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye for now.